So thank you everyone for joining us for our session on evidence and advocacy for non-competitive labor markets. And the session is organized as a symposium. And so the way we're going to do this is have a few really brief presentations, and then we'll have a roundtable with a couple more people joining. For those who don't know me, I'm Kate Bahn. I'm the Director of Labor Market Policy at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. I'll be presenting briefly on a policy report we put out last year on discrimination and monopsony power. After me, we'll hear from Ellora Derenoncourt, Assistant Professor of Economics at University of California, Berkeley, who will be presenting on spillovers from voluntary minimum wage increases at employers, which is a joint research project with David Weil and Clemens Noelke. And then hopefully we will also be joined by, yes, Ioana just joined. Then we'll be joined by Ioana Marinescu, who is an Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Pennsylvania. And I also want to congratulate Ioana on her recent tenure announcement. And Ioana will be presenting on, yeah, we should take a second to clap for that. Very, very well deserved. And Ioana will present on boosting wages when labor markets aren't competitive, which is based on a essay she wrote for the Equitable website and also based on her broad body of research on concentrated labor markets. And then following those brief presentations, we'll have a roundtable discussion, which will include Ahmer Qadeer, who is the Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Service Employees International Union, and David Seligman, who's the Executive Director of Tort Justice, which is a nonprofit law firm that works to advance worker power. So I have a couple slides. Ellora and Ioana, do you also have slides, or I could just speak, or I could do slides? Okay.
I do have a few slides.
Okay, great.
Same here.
Okay, great. So I will try to share my screen. Can everyone see those slides? Yes, okay. Great. So we put out a report last fall on discrimination and monopsony power. And some of, just the framing behind this work we did is looking at the persistence of wage gaps by gender, race, and ethnicity. We know that these wage gaps converged in the 1970s and 1980s, but there's been less progress since then. A couple other particular stylized facts that I think are important to draw attention to is that there's also been stalled convergence of occupational segregation in this time frame. So some of the catch up in wage gaps by gender, race, and ethnicity helped when there was more integration across occupations, but that has since slowed down. And just some specific facts that the Black-white wage gap for men is 80%, and it's actually been getting worse in recent years. The gender wage gap overall is a similar level of about 80% and has made only marginal progress. And then we've also published some work at Equitable Growth where we look at intersectional wage gaps. So we look at what the wage gap is for groups of women workers based on their demographic background. And we find that the sum of the wage gaps facing Black women, Latin and Latinx women in particular are greater than the sum of gender and race and ethnicity wage gaps just added up together. They're multiplicative. And traditionally how this would be explained in economics would be through the human capital model, where wage differences are explained by differences in productivity between workers. And those measurements of productivity are things like education level, what occupations and industries you're working in, your years of work experience. And then employers will compete for workers based on how productive workers are until the wage offered equals the marginal productivity of labor. But we know that this doesn't actually help explain these gender wage gaps and racial wage gaps very well. For example, that the gender wage gap and racial wage gap are actually higher at higher levels of education. So when workers do seek those sort of different types of human capital investments that should lead to higher wages, earning higher wages for those workers necessarily. And when we do these intersectional wage gap decompositions, a much larger portion of the gender wage gap, in particular for Black and Latinx women, can't be explained by differences in the human capital. So that would be interpreted as the result of discrimination or other unobserved characteristics we can't see. And the reason that this is important to sort of dig into this and try to understand why these wage gaps are so persistent and think about how the human capital model is inadequate to explain this is because this sort of idea of a skills gap, or the reason that wages are the levels they are, is due to these human capital allotments, and these skills undergirds a lot of economic policy designed to increase earnings. So for example, focusing on things like workforce development. In the pandemic, there's been sort of bipartisan proposals to give workers sort of capital in order to invest in their skills training, maybe invest in higher education, but these things don't always lead to higher wages for workers. And so falling into a focus on sort of individual ability to get more skill investment may not be sufficient to make up for these large structural persistent wage gaps by race and gender. And so the work we've done is thinking about how lack of competition for workers, or the sort of lack of the fact that employers may not have to compete as heavily for certain groups of workers may influence the wage offered to those groups of workers. And so we're relying on monopsony theory. We're thinking about how the job search frictions facing different groups of workers may help explain the differences in wages that they're facing. So we ask sort of, are there factors that we think might influence mobility for workers that are particularly pertinent to women workers and to Black and Latinx workers? For women workers, one of our insights is that care responsibilities might affect how they search for jobs. So for example, it might limit your commute time or the work schedule you can work if you are the primary caretaker for your children. Maybe it's harder to commute an hour for work if you know you may be the person who's going to have to go pick up a kid from daycare if they're sick. And so it's going to limit how much you can search for jobs. And then one of the second insights in our paper is looking at how wealth inequality might influence job search. So we know there's huge disparities in wealth for Black Americans and Hispanic Americans in the US, as well as for women-headed households. And if a worker doesn't have personal wealth, if they're less likely to have personal wealth, they may not be able to search for jobs in the same way. They might not be able to take periods of non-employment in order to find the right fit for them. And it's just going to be harder for them to take the time to find a job where they'll ultimately earn more money and be more productive because they're just sort of stuck to accept the first acceptable job for themselves. And when these factors are sort of persistent across the economy, it's probably likely that employers will make lower wage offers to workers they know have fewer other options because of these factors. And then sort of broadly, I think probably some other folks will get into this a little bit more. There's also other sort of structural factors that we think might have increased the employer's ability to set wages in non-competitive ways. And that includes things like the decreasing value of the minimum wage, declining unionization, and poorly enforced labor regulations like wage theft. And so just to finish up, we'll get into this more in the discussion probably, but just going through some of the policy implications of thinking about the labor market in this non-competitive way, is that we need to do things to offset employer-side wage setting power. So do things to increase worker power and do things to increase wages, statutory wages for workers that would help offset some of this employer wage setting power. And then also address some of these job search frictions. And so that would be doing things like universal policies to help women workers care for their families, and also hopefully help sort of diminish the gender disparity in care responsibilities within families. Policies designed to equalize wealth across race and ethnicity, and so that would include things particularly like reparations, as well as things like addressing student debt and housing housing differences between workers based on race and ethnicity. And then broadly increasing the social safety net, because if it's hard for workers to take periods of non-employment or they're worried about losing things like access to healthcare, they're less likely to search for jobs and match into better jobs. So there's research that shows things like better access to Medicaid helps workers find and match into higher paying jobs. So we know that if we had a broader social safety net, it might reduce some of that job lock that sort of leaves workers stuck in particular types of jobs. So I'm looking forward to discussing this more with this great group of people, and I'll hand it over to Ellora.
All right, thank you so much, Kate, and thanks everyone for having me. So I'll be presenting, as Kate mentioned, joint work with David Weil and Clemens Noelke of Brandeis, spillover effects from voluntary employer minimum wages. Make sure I can get over to the, one second. There you go. All right. So over the last 6 years or so, a number of major retailers have announced voluntary minimum wages throughout their establishments in the United States. And these increases have come in the context of a stagnating nominal or declining real federal minimum wage, as well as a large union-led movement for a $15 minimum wage at the local, state level, federal level, and also targeting specific employers. And then at the same time in the background, we have seen some apparent success of this campaign through increased local and state minimum wage changes. So in this study, we actually examine an understudied aspect of these wage policy changes over the last few years, which is employers voluntarily announcing company-wide minimum wage policies. And we study the impact these policies have had on the broader labor market. So that's what you can see in this figure here. In the lines in the background in gray and blue are state minimum wage policies over the last 5 or 6 years. And then in company logos, Walmart and Target and Amazon, you can see the announcement of various company-wide minimum wages by these retailers. So part of the novelty of our project is bringing relatively new data sources in to study these employer policies. And one of these sources is Burning Glass Technologies' database of online job ads. So here we're able to document changes in the distribution of wages for advertised hourly positions at Amazon after their announcement of a $15 minimum wage in October of 2018. So you can see that right at the time of the announcement, there's a sharp decline. This line here traces the percentage of jobs advertising wages below $15 an hour. That drops precipitously after their announcement, and jobs exactly at 15 rise, as well as jobs at higher wage bins over the next several months after the announcement. So what we study is, how do these large retailers' policies affect actually other employers in the labor market, coming back to kind of the original hypothesis of, or rhetoric in the Fight for 15 campaign, that these large retailers can act as leaders or standard bearers in the broader low wage market. And the core of our empirical strategy is to measure the fraction of ads in very specific occupation and commuting zone cells at other employers that were below the incoming large retailer minimum wage. So in the case of Amazon, $15 prior to the announcement. This is drawing on a very old empirical strategy in the minimum wage literature that uses variation in the bite of a national minimum wage policy to estimate its effects at the local level. So what we estimate is the effect of moving, and here this map is just showing you the sort of distribution of jobs paying below 15 at non-Amazon employers across the United States. And what we're going to examine is the effect of moving from jobs that are 0% exposed or no jobs below 15 to those that are 100% exposed. And we're going to measure that every month, going as far back as 12 months before the policy and then 12 months after Amazon's policy. So using this strategy, we estimate significant increases in the wages at non-Amazon employers starting in the month of Amazon's announcement and kind of trending upwards after. And what's reassuring is that, being highly exposed or having lots of jobs below 15 is actually uncorrelated with wage trends at those employers prior to the announcement. In our paper, in our working paper, we also show that wages at these non-Amazon employers after the announcement tend to bunch right at $15, suggesting that these employers are actually mimicking the wage strategy of Amazon after their announcement. We extend this research design to the other large retailers who announce minimum wage policies, and using the current population survey, where we can estimate effects both on wages and employment, we look at the impacts of these wage policies in industries outside of these large retailers, so spillovers to other industries. And what we find consistently across all of these different natural experiments is wage effects that are substantially larger than the employment effects. And we estimate small, negative, and precise declines in employment. What we can infer from the relationship between the wage effects of these large retailer policies on other employers, as well as the employment effects, is that these wage policies really do behave, at least in terms of their ultimate impact, like local or state minimum wage increases, resulting in large increases in wages with limited effects on employment. So here we place our employment elasticities, or the responsiveness of employment to wages, in context with evidence from other studies focusing on statutory or government minimum wages. Of course, we believe that the mechanism here is quite different, likely due to imperfectly competitive factors. You could think of oligopsonistic competition between employers who have varying degrees of market power, strategically responding to the wages of other employers. So I think I will end there to open it up for the discussion later on. I'm looking forward to that. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Ellora. And so Ioana, over to you.
All right, so I'm gonna keep it pretty short to allow for more time for the discussion. So I just wanna give a very brief overview of the short paper that I presented, that I prepared for the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, which is based on my own research on monopsony power. And the paper is called Boosting Wages When Labor Markets Are Not Competitive. So I summarized the evidence, and I think by now we know that workers are often underpaid due to a lack of competition among employers, which is monopsony power. And by underpaid, I mean that they're paid less than their marginal productivity, less than what they would be paid under a competitive labor market. And so how do we know that? Two kinds of evidence. First of all, we have research showing that workers are not very sensitive to wages, that they don't quit even when they're underpaid, so that it's profitable for companies to underpay them, at least to some extent. Of course, some workers would quit, but there is a sweet spot where we can underpay people and still have enough people who stay with us so that the strategy is profitable. And then the second thing is that I've also shown there that the majority of US labor markets are highly concentrated, meaning that there are few employers or just a few large employers that dominate the market in terms of jobs. So, you know, if you're looking for a cashier, many cases, there are just not that many employers that you could go to in your local commuting zone that you could easily commute to. So those are the two main ways that you can demonstrate that workers are underpaid. So what do you do knowing that? Well, the first policy solution is to strengthen antitrust enforcement. And first off, there should be merger reviews that take into account the anti-competitive effects of these mergers on the labor market. And basically, the idea here is that when two employers merge, that means that that lowers the number of opportunities for workers to find jobs, and that puts downward pressure on wages through a decreasing in competition for workers. And in fact, there are some very nice papers by Arnold in particular for the whole US labor market looking at those effects and showing that indeed the mergers do decrease wages when they lead to large decreases in competition for workers. So that's exactly what you would expect. Smaller mergers that don't change the situation much don't have a big effect on wages, but the big ones that really significantly diminish workers' opportunities by creating a mega employer, those are the ones that really reduce wages. And then the second pillar of this policy is to have stronger enforcement against employment monopsony power, not just for wages, but in other domains. And I invite you to look at our legislative proposal of Eric Posner, where we've been through a number of different aspects of this, talking, for example, about non-competes and other aspects of anti-competitive behavior that could be policed by the antitrust authorities. Then another thing that can be done here is to increase the minimum wage. So, you know, this blends in nicely with Ellora's presentation that she just did. And so here, the key way in which the minimum wage is related to the monopsony power is that employers many times, in many cases, can afford to pay more, since again, the whole idea of monopsony is that workers are underpaid. And so therefore, there is a margin for wages to increase without losing employment. And by increasing the minimum wage, you could get closer to the competitive equilibrium where workers are paid according to their own marginal productivity. And so that's why you would expect the minimum wage to have a positive effect on employment, even when markets are particularly non-competitive. And in fact, in my own work, I've shown that that's the case, and that minimum wage tends to increase employment when markets are really not very competitive, and can indeed decrease employment in very competitive labor markets in some cases, as classic theory predicts. And that's simply because in some cases, the minimum wage goes above the marginal productivity of some workers, who thereby can lose employment. So, but again, most of the literature on the minimum wage shows aggregate effects that are close to zero. And just to fill in everybody here who might be listening, I think our understanding now is that a lot of those bigger picture effects that are not negative, and I think I love to hear Ellora's view on how the micro effects she's looking at generalize more broadly. I think part of what we've seen is that workers move away from the lowest paid employers and industries toward higher paying companies that can afford to pay more, so that you don't necessarily see a loss of employment in the aggregate, but there could be a loss of employment among employers that pay very low wages. And I think that's worth keeping in mind, that if you focus on a very, very specific, very, very low wage type of employer or industry, and also that's in a very competitive market, you might indeed see negative effects. It doesn't necessarily mean that there are negative effects at the broader level of the low wage labor market. And then finally, the other thing is that you can strengthen unions. And what the research has shown with respect to labor market concentration and competition is that unions, in the presence of unions, the negative impact of concentration or lack of competition on wages is lessened in the presence of unions. So in other terms, unions act as a barrier that can protect workers against the adverse effects of a lack of competition. And so this is especially useful to think about in situations where there might be some kind of natural monopoly, for example, or it's not easy to foster a lot more competition. Unions are also a tool that can be used to fight these negative effects. And so I'm going to end here, and I really look forward to the discussion. Thank you. All right.
Great. Thank you both, Ellora and Ioana. So just to first dig into the research a little bit more before we have our discussion about the policy solutions, what are some of the biggest advances in research on monopsony and lack of competition in the past 5 to 10 years? There's sort of been a rise in research on monopsony maybe in the past 20 years or so, but in the past 5 to 10 years, we're seeing a lot of new research that is different than, or is more cutting edge. And so what are some examples of that, and what does that teach us about the existence of lack of competition? Ellora, I know you had mentioned specifically this in your, I'm gonna toss it over to you. You'd sort of hinted at this.
Yeah, definitely if you think about research on wage determination and wage setting over the last 5 to 10 years, I would, and I'm definitely gonna eventually defer to Ioana, who's spent a very long time in this literature. I would kind of categorize it as maybe 3 broad waves. I think we had a rise of literature showing very clearly the impact of your employer or your firm on wages using very kind of novel administrative employer-employee matched data sets, predominantly in European contexts. But these papers, you can think of Card, Cardozo, Heining, Klein, which is a nice summary of this literature, is really just providing very clear evidence of the importance of your employer's wage setting policies for your own wages. This literature doesn't directly point to employer market power per se. There are other models and sources that can generate these wage effects, like efficiency wages, or just different types of heterogeneity in the workplace. But it's consistent. It's also consistent with employer wage setting power. And then I would say the kind of second broad recent development in the literature would be the kind of new minimum wage literature that's importing, for example, bunching methodology from public finance to really examine wage increases and employment effects very locally within wage distributions, and just basically providing yet again another wave of very clean evidence of limited employment responsiveness to large minimum wage increases. Once again, kind of not very consistent with frictionless, perfectly competitive labor markets. And then finally, I would put kind of a third category of literature on specific determinants of wages, such as outside options, employer misoptimization or behavioral aspects of employers. So I'm thinking of the work of Dubé, Manning, and Naidu. Some work showing that there's kind of wage setting practices within large multinational establishments where wages kind of propagate certain there's a uniformity of wages within firms, and all of these things are really inconsistent with simple supply and demand determinants of wages. Some micro evidence of specific sources of frictions in the labor market that would give rise to wage setting power of employers. So I can think of the work of Caldwell and Harmon, Caldwell and Daniele focusing on workers outside options, et cetera. So I would say, that's kind of the evidence that I would point to, and just really kind of giving us very clear empirical evidence of some of these sources of imperfect competition in the labor market.
Ioana, is there more you'd like to add as well?
I think that was a really excellent summary. I think, one of the things to keep in mind for us all that, I'm working on a paper on this, so it's very salient to me, is the idea of job differentiation. And so that's one of the sources of monopsony power, but it's quite important to think about because it can occur even in markets that are seemingly competitive, in the sense that there are in fact many employers that you could potentially go to, but that doesn't mean that from the point of view of each individual workers, those employers are perfect substitutes. And so in particular, what we show in our paper with Jose Azar and Steve Berry is one of the key, and it's very obvious, but distance matters. So, there might be a bunch of employers, but not all of them are as close to your home. And even more generally, just jobs are differentiated in many ways. And so that can give employers market power, even in a situation that might look very competitive in terms of the fact that there are many potential jobs and potential employers out there. And so I think that's just something that's important to keep in mind. Another thing that I think is quite interesting is, and we don't yet have enough evidence on this, is how does the potential market power translate into lower wages? So we definitely have some evidence on this. For example, I said mergers that really increase concentration, lower wages. There's also some interesting estimates looking at estimating basically markdowns, so how much workers are underpaid based on a production function approach, where you can kind of see how workers are paid relative to other inputs. But I think we realize that employers definitely have market powers, but how much are they truly putting to work for them in various circumstances? It's a little bit still not completely clear. So what I mean with this, I just want to clarify for everybody, just because you could underpay people doesn't necessarily mean you're going to go do it and squeeze them to the max in every case, right? So there's many considerations, that might be outside of our models, why employers don't go do that to the max. And, Ellora mentioned this paper, for example, of the fact that wages tend to be somewhat uniform at the firm level, even in other countries, even though they don't have to pay those poor people elsewhere as much. But if this is a high wage firm that lives in a high wage, country that has a high minimum wage, it tends to diffuse some of those gains worldwide, even though it doesn't arguably have to do that in those other jurisdictions. So I think, it's clear that employers exploit this market power to some extent, but it's also clear that they don't always fully exploit it. And trying to understand the ins and outs of this issue, I think it's a bit of an interesting topic for further research.
Great, thank you. And that's a really good point, Ioana, about that they may not exercise their full monopsony power just because they have it. So a sort of more general question that I think anyone could answer is, how has competition in labor markets changed over time? So why is this something that is maybe being increasingly recognized, or are there sort of other factors that have led to changes in the competitive environment and labor markets over time. If I can, I'm gonna, I know that David, you had talked really briefly about like fissured workplaces as maybe part of it as well, and how the policy environment around fissured workplaces might affect some of this. So if you don't mind me throwing it over to you to start with that.
Sure, very happy to touch base about that, Kate. I will say I feared you might say that in light of our conversation right before, because I always hesitate to talk about too much about fissured workplaces with David Weil in the presentation. So David, feel free to jump in, of course, and I will, but I won't put you in the hot seat, certainly. Yeah, I mean, I think that proliferation of the fissured workplace, which is a consequence of all kinds of intersecting issues that have a lot of overlap with the issues that Ioana and Ellora are discussing. Sort of shareholder primacy, firms increasingly not investing in production sort of internally. That has had all kinds of consequences for workers and for immigrant workers of color in particular, and lots of overlap with these issues of unfair competition and monopsony. So sort of on just two sort of themes to highlight about the overlap. One is going back to Ioana's and Ellora's point about how you see sort of firm-wide standardization of wages. Obviously, like fissuring is a way for firms to avoid that dynamic, right? So you don't see the standardization between staffing agency employees and direct hires, right? Employees of subcontractors and direct hires, and then of course something that I've worked on through a policy and litigation lens are the ways in which firms across a fissured workplace will engage in unfair competition, to use the term, the sort of framework of Sanjukta Paul, whom many may know, the ways in which firms across a fissured workplace may coordinate in ways that undermine worker power and worker mobility across a fissured workplace. So, for example, employees of a franchisee are prevented from going to work, from working for other franchisees under the same brand or directly for the franchisor. Those, along with the fissured workplace, we've seen those increasing use of those types of arrangements. Just to provide a very direct example, just about every hotel worker in Denver is not employed directly by the hotel, especially in non-union for non-union workplaces, but is instead employed through a staffing agency. Those staffing agencies all have arrangements with the hotels to prevent the hotels from hiring on these employees sort of permanently. So keeping employees is sort of entrenched in the permanent temporary status. I'll leave it there, but obviously lots to say about how policy and enforcement might respond to those trends.
Yeah, and I'll also segue a little bit to talk about there are some really specific industry differences in how competition may have changed within specific industries, and so there's a lot of research that shows that market concentration is particularly important in the healthcare industry, where there's been a lot of consolidation. So I'm going to use that as an opportunity to hand it over to Ahmer, who I know also just recently gave testimony on this in the Senate Judiciary Committee.
Thanks, Kate, and thanks to the other panelists. This is a great discussion, and they're great papers. And we really appreciate all of the research that you've done, and it helps to inform policy strategy. And responses for unions and workers. So I just wanted to start with that. I would say in the healthcare industry, we've seen many decades really of evidence of employer collusion, even around some specific cases, particularly nurses. About 15 years ago, SEIU did a series of lawsuits against hospitals, where hospitals in certain markets had colluded to with non-poach agreements between nurses and kind of had kept nurses' wages low. So despite there being a shortage of nurses, the nurses' wages remained low because the hospitals were able to muster this counteracting power through non-poach agreements, and by not hiring one another's staff or not being in competition with one another. And we've seen that in other parts of healthcare too, other kinds of jobs and job descriptions. There's a substantial wave, we would say, of consolidation in the hospital sector in particular. There's been a couple of good papers on this that have shown how that affects the wages of healthcare workers. And so we're looking forward to more research on this, more evidence of this, but the way that we often see it sort of showing up also, in addition to wages, is the kinds of opportunities that workers have. So, for example, in Pittsburgh, where you have really one hospital system that dominates the market, right? UPMC, for example, workers are locked into the job. Maybe they've paid for their education to be a tech or a healthcare worker of some kind. Many times people view themselves as a healthcare worker. They want to be in a caring profession. They don't want to abandon working at a hospital to work in retail. They want to work in a caring profession because that suits them. That appeals to them. Or they want to have a job that's closer to them, or that's convenient, or other factors as well. And all of those factors, I would say, combine in a sense to give leverage and bargaining power of consolidated health systems over healthcare workers. So I'd say it shows up in wages, it shows up in working conditions, it shows up in the kinds of voice and remedies that people have on the job, in terms of being able to address problems as well.
Kate, do you mind if I follow up on that? Is that all right? And I sort of, I think this is a question for Ioana and Ellora, and I don't think it's an easy one. But I really appreciate your point, Ahmer, about the non-wage consequences of monopsony power. I mean, anecdotally, that shows up all the time for me. I litigated a case under the California antitrust laws a few years ago against a prominent fast food franchise company, the executive director, or the CEO of which was a former nominee for Secretary of Labor under the prior administration. And our clients in that case, although they perceived the fact that they couldn't go between restaurants under the brand as undermining their ability to extract higher wages, what really stuck out to them was the non-wage stuff. In particular, actually, it was about scheduling unpredictability, which is a huge issue in the fast food space. And I'll also say, and Ellora, to your points about Amazon, we represent several Amazon workers, some of whom think that Amazon's wages are not, that much of an issue for them. Some of them have concerns about Amazon's wages, but all of which sort of appreciate the Amazon's monopsony power, even if they're not, articulating it that way, and all of which have other serious non-wage concerns, both with respect to, in particular, workplace safety and health, but also, Amazon's extraordinary efforts to squelch worker voice and worker power. And it would be just fantastic, to have more research on these issues. And we're just wondering, what thoughts you all have, and whether there's a way to do that research that you think could be useful.
Ioana, I see that you have your hand up if you want to respond to that.
Yes, exactly. So I'm actually doing some research on this at this very moment with Aaron Sojourner and UIQ, where we basically show that the way basically a job is a package, and typically the wage is just one of the dimensions of it, and that kind of goes with what I was saying earlier regarding job differentiation. That jobs don't only differ in wages, but they differ in other aspects, and that includes working conditions and other aspects of schedule flexibility and things like that. And so what we do there is that we show that descriptively, higher wages tend to go hand in hand with fewer labor violations across health and safety, wage theft, and so on and so forth. And so it really what it looks like employers are doing is that they tend to, and this is consistent if you want, with employers considering the whole package of the job and not just the wage. And so therefore, again, you would expect that under monopsony, not just the wages are going to be worse, but working conditions are going to be worse. And in fact, in that paper, we show some evidence consistent with higher concentration, increasing labor violations, and therefore presumably making working conditions worse as well. And so, I think that those aspects also merit attention because, again, workers don't only care about wages. Wages are important, but I think especially in the low-wage labor market, these issues around working conditions are very important to keep in mind.
Yeah, I'll just chime in. Anything in addition to the work that Ioana is doing, we still do need more work on these non-wage aspects of jobs and how employer policies around them affect workers. And it's just a lot harder to observe these types of policies at specific employers. So for example, in our study of the spillover effects of, say, Amazon's wage policy, we did a lot of kind of qualitative work trying to understand the policies of the different large retailers, and definitely read about other adjustments Amazon made simultaneously with the wage, implementing a minimum wage, such as removing stock options and bonuses from compensation. We look at so using data from Glassdoor, where workers review their employers and provide satisfaction reports, we don't see corresponding increases in satisfaction with the wage increases that spill over to other employers. So, if you would think that those two things go together, maybe there's some kind of, other adjustment other employers are making that's kind of eating away at these potential satisfaction gains. But we do definitely need more work on this. And the last thing I would say is, Danny Schneider, who's now at the Harvard Kennedy School and has done so much work on scheduling policy. I remember him telling the story of wanting to study, I think it was Starbucks was going to, change their scheduling policy, make it more worker friendly. And they had announced a specific date. So he was busy kind of collecting survey data from Facebook to look at it like a difference in impact of improved scheduling practices. And they just actually didn't change their scheduling practices. So an important thing for us when we started looking at the wage spillovers was to actually see that wages at the firms that were announcing these policies were indeed changing. And it's not clear that they do the same thing with these harder to measure non-wage aspects of jobs.
That's super interesting. So I know we only have about 15 minutes left, and I want to make sure that people in the audience have a chance to ask a question or two at the end. So I'm going to ask one last two-part question about policy to really dig into specific policy solutions. So the first part is, what are some of the most effective policy or advocacy tools that we have already? What do we already have that we could be using more of? And then what changes need to be made to policy, legislation, or legal precedent to more effectively address lack of competition? So I don't know. Anyone wants to chime in first, feel free to do so. And if nobody volunteers, I will call on people.
Well, sorry, Ahmer, were you about to say something?
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I was briefly just going to say, just sort of keying off the last point, that, this last the question about non-wage effects of employer monopsony power. I think one easy policy tool that some states have incorporated into recent non-compete statutes is really simple from an enforcement perspective. It's statutory damages for engaging in unfair competition. So meaning automatic damages without having to demonstrate, actual, actual damages or harm to wages. So recently, the District of Columbia and Washington, for example, have passed laws prohibiting non-compete agreements in certain contexts, and they've said that presenting a worker with these non-competes is illegal, and provided sort of set statutory damages for those workers who don't need to hire the fancy experts to demonstrate wage harm. So that just sticks out to me as one tool among many that we should have in mind when we legislate these issues.
I think everybody can guess what I'm going to say is a solution to monopsony power, right? So at the risk of being overly obvious, I would say we know how to counteract employer bargaining power, right? So collective bargaining is certain, and strengthening unions is there's a set of policies that can encourage multi-employer, broad-based bargaining. All of those kinds of policies will help to mitigate the monopsony power of employers. And I think as we think about antitrust reform, and as we think about the ways in which antitrust laws and policies can be used and can be applied in the labor market, I think one thing we're thinking about is, and contemplating, is how collective bargaining and other mechanisms for worker voice can offset monopsony power. That you could have a merger that creates tremendous power for an employer, but the remedy doesn't have to be just to break up that company or prevent the merger. There are remedies that are related to voice as well. So.
Ellora and Ioana, do either of you also want to chime in on that question, or both of you?
I mean, just to say, yeah, I think I'm grateful that Ahmer brought up unions as another policy lever here. There's plenty of work showing that declining union density is related to rising wage inequality, and more recent work about the importance of collective bargaining for reducing gender gaps in the workplace. I think maybe another policy that was briefly brought up earlier is minimum wages, and universal labor standards that kind of bring up everybody's outside options can have these spillover ripple effects for workers who do experience wage markdowns given their set of outside options, whether that comes from different constraints, family or household constraints, or commute times to jobs, availability of jobs, discrimination. So I think there are a lot of frictions that these universal policies can help address, and that's not something that's been, I think that debate has been so focused on employment, but there are these other benefits of minimum wage policy and other universal policies.
So I think I'm going to also briefly chime in to say that antitrust policy is obviously a tool that I already mentioned, but the nice thing about it is that at some level, thanks to our collective research, I think the federal antitrust authorities are well aware of what's going on and are broadly in agreement that it is legitimate to apply antitrust tools to the labor market. But the problem is the agencies are severely underfunded and understaffed. So I think one of the big things that is actually, given the billions we're talking about for other plans, giving more money to the federal antitrust authorities, and especially also with a mission to staff up experts in the labor domain so that they can do more enforcement, even without changing anything. There's just, our paper with Eric Posner shows that there's so very little enforcement at all of labor market cases, even though they are already included in the antitrust statuses. So in a way, I think that this is a pretty low-hanging fruit, as well as just in terms of just use what's already there, give them the means to do so. And again, the fact is that these institutions are well aware of the work we've all been doing, in academia, and are able to do the job if only they had more means. Now, of course, another obstacle. So I want to say, like, what are the obstacles in antitrust? One is means. So, they need a little bit more oomph budget-wise and work power-wise in the agencies to do the work, and that would be really welcome. Second thing is there is some legal uncertainty. So even though I think as academics, we successfully sort of reminded everybody and established that these labor aspects are really a key constituent of antitrust, I think some judges might see things differently in some cases, and therefore, just legislation at a minimum that reaffirms, how in fact antitrust laws do apply to the labor market, could lower what we call with Eric Posner legal uncertainty, meaning that, again, like you never know, you might fall on a judge that sees things differently. So that's another low-hanging fruit. Here, I'm really talking about the small incremental steps that in antitrust could move the needle forward. And again, those two are bigger budget for the antitrust authorities with a mission to look into labor market aspects, and two, potentially clarifying legislation that, again, at a minimum, without adding anything really new, just kind of reaffirms that antitrust laws apply to labor markets. So those I would see as two, small, feasible steps forward, within antitrust enforcement.
Does anyone want to add based on what other speakers had said?
I'll just say that in response to Ioana's point, I want to highlight, New York, the New York legislature is considering, the 21st Century Antitrust Act, which I believe is what it's called. I'm not in the best position to talk about it, but an example of the ways in which you can sort of directly, sort of expand and clarify antitrust principles to get at these problems. In particular, a focus on, as opposed to market power, on market dominance, in particular, in the labor market, where it reduces the threshold for establishing dominance.
Great. And so we have about 5 more minutes, and there's a couple questions in the chat that I'll draw attention to. And if I miss anyone's question, please let me know. There was one from James Coons on what we know about how the broader access to healthcare through the Affordable Care Act might have affected how employees choose to work for specific employers due to they might have better access to healthcare plans at particular employees. So I'll throw that out first if anyone has a thought on that. I don't know a ton about this, particularly how the greater employer-sponsored coverage affects it. I mean, the only thing I can think of is knowing that it reduces job lock when there's more generous levels for Medicaid expansion. So I do know that like broader access has helped workers choose jobs based on getting better pay and better matches, but I don't know about employer-sponsored plans. If anyone else has any knowledge about it, okay. Well, people can also chime in on the chat if they have thoughts on that question. And then Maya Pinto also asked if there are intellectual property law reforms that can help mitigate monopsony or monopoly power.
Well, I see somebody ask about basic income, so can I take that one? EITC and basic income, because that's a favorite topic of mine. So, cash transfer policies, the EITC is quite different from the basic income. So one issue with the EITC is that it's conditional on working. And therefore, at least in theory, and there's some empirical evidence supporting that, as you're only giving people additional income if they're going to work, that actually reduces worker bargaining power because it's tied to working. And there is some empirical evidence suggesting that indeed this decreased workers' wages. Whereas if you have something like a universal basic income that is not tied to working, it's not tied to not working either, please note. It's like either way, whether you work or not, you still get your universal basic income. This is something that can act as a floor, and so it can boost wages and the bargaining power of the lowest paid. So this is not going to be useful across the wage distribution because the basic income is always going to be somewhat limited. But for the workers with the lowest pay, it really boosts their outside option and therefore increases their bargaining power. And we expect an improvement in both wages as well as working conditions, just as we discussed before. So I think that basic income has a complementary role to play here in terms of limiting monopsony power, but mostly, as I said, for the lowest paid workers, it doesn't, go further up in the income distribution. And that's where unions could help, more across the distribution rather than just looking at low income workers.
Great. Any other thoughts on the basic income question? I mean, it's sort of interesting. I'll just provide my own random opinions on it, but I sort of think like it is useful for giving low wage workers a better outside option if it sort of helps smooth some of that issue around wealth inequality if they have basic income, and it increases well-being of workers. I think the argument against it would be things like policy priorities, the idea, the sort of fear that if we had universal basic income or more guaranteed income programs, that would take funding away from other social safety net programs that we know are quite effective in helping worker well-being and household well-being. And then the second one would be sort of the ways in which people would use additional income support based on where they are on the income distribution. So which is to say that if you are a lower income worker, you're going to use it for more consumption. If you're a higher income worker, you may be able to use it for investment or wealth building. And so it might exacerbate inequality on some other measures.
So just to jump in, Kay, I don't want to monopolize, but as you know, this is a pet topic of mine. So, when I think about a basic income, I think about a funded basic income, which means that, you're giving the same amount to everybody, but in order to keep this budget neutral, any realistic funding stream takes more from high income people and then low income people. And in fact, on net, the basic income, again, under any realistic financing scheme that is budget neutral, and I'm making it budget neutral for now to simplify, is going to be progressive. So that in fact, on net, higher income people are getting less than before, and low income people are getting more than before. So there is not really an opportunity for them to extra invest, because actually on net, net of taxes, they now have less income than they had before. So I don't think that certainly for a funded basic income, I don't think that that's a significant concern.
Thank you for that clarification. That was actually really helpful to my own thinking on the topic. So we are at time. I want to thank everyone. I think this was a really great discussion. This was kind of my dream discussion, and one of the joys of being able to have the job I have is all of you said yes when I asked you to join this panel. It's exactly who I would want on this panel. And you all agreed to be part of it. So I think it was a really great discussion, and I really appreciate everyone's different insight and expertise.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. And I'll say, Ioana, thinking she's monopolizing a conversation is one of the monopolies that I don't mind. So couldn't resist.